Hello, my name is Mitchell Katz. I am an interviewer for the Public Library of Cincinnati and Hamilton County. I am interviewing Earl Slanker on January 10th, 2007 at the main library. Our camera operator today is Dennis Daly. Also present today is Mr. Slanker's son, Tom. Welcome. Mr. Slanker is a veteran of World War II. He was a pilot in the 386th Bomb Group, the 552nd Squadron, and we're here today to hear his story.
Anyhow, well, thank you, Rich. What I'm going to do is to review the book that I put together over several years ago of my service with the Air Force, then Army Air Forces. Prior to that was the Air Corps. Anyhow, this is compromised because of tight security restrictions, which you were told not to reveal mission information, targets and results and the bad things. So that could have some real spicy things that people would like to hear about, but it's not in what I put together. But the recollections, which are not too long here, this is being written at the suggestion and gentle persuasion of family, friends, and in particular the organization at the University of Akron known as the B-26 Archive History Advisory Council, now identified as the Marauder Historical Society. I wanted for some time to assemble my notes, letters, and thoughts about the war, especially from my family, so here goes. Having wanted to fly for several years, the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor was a further incentive to go down that route by joining the Army Air Corps. While we had good information from radio and newspaper reports, the war seemed to be far away, and getting mixed up in real fighting didn't settle in until I'd completed flight training. Getting through it, the aviation cadet program was a serious undertaking, and the fear of failure was always there. Initially, flying was harder than I'd ever imagined, but that didn't last long. My days in primary flight training were the most difficult out of my class of 181. 87 were washed out, that is, failed and shipped off to Bombardier, Navigator, gunnery school, or whatever. Their days of learning to become a pilot were over. I may have just squeaked by my 20-hour flight check, but after that, my training, although not easy, became less of a mountain to climb. There were many flights that were fun and a great sense of accomplishment. Getting my wings and graduation in July 1943 was a major milestone for this 21-year-old kid. Besides, I was going to get to fly the Martin B-26 that I had seen so much of flying around Patterson Field and near my home in 1941 and 42. Having assigned to the B-26 base in Del Rio, Texas, my first flight in the Marauder was a real wake-up call. God, it was noisy and big and a little frightening. I wondered how I managed to get into this situation. There were 62 new pilots starting in my class that would run for 8 weeks, and giving up was not an option. I was to learn much about the airplane and its many operating systems, and after 120 hours of flight time, I felt confident in being able to get the airplane up and down. I learned that it could bite, and it could be fatal if you let it get ahead of you. Under the right conditions, it would fly on one engine. In time, I'd become another one of the guys who had just mastered the airplane and would move on to the next stop of working with the full crew. By the end of 1943, I was well into my combat crew training at Lake Charles, Louisiana, after a few weeks at MacDill Field in Florida. We were doing things with the airplane that were seen in training films and of combat operations shown in movie newsreel screens. We were being trained and conditioned for serious work ahead. What was really to come was far from clear. The ultimate destination was certain, as B-26 were only being in large numbers in the European theater and the Mediterranean theater. Getting there was an experience all by itself. Being ordered to pick up a brand new airplane and fly it halfway around the world just wasn't an everyday happening. On March 26, 44, 26 crews departed for Savannah, Georgia to pick up new airplanes. En route there, all bombardiers and tail gunners were split off to go to New York to take a ship to our final destinations. The next stop was West Palm Beach, Florida, where we picked up an ATC navigator required for the long flights ahead. I left for Puerto Rico on April 4th, 44, and a B-26F under sealed secret orders with a crew of 5. Once en route, the orders were opened and learned that our destination was the 9th Air Force, United Kingdom, via the South Atlantic route. The route to England would take nearly 60 hours flying time and 3 long weeks. The airplane had some serious carburetor problems and, along with several weather delays, presented some very interesting moments. It's over 12,000 miles by this route and mostly over water, jungle, and desert. We carried a life raft, wore Mae West life preservers, but we stored our parachutes in the aft bomb bay as bailing out just wasn't an option. It was on to British Guiana, Brazil, Ascension Island in the South Atlantic, Liberia, Dakar, Marrakech in Morocco, and then on up to southwest England, arriving on April 26th. It was a real lesson in geography. During this time, there was a steady stream of B-26s and other military aircraft doing the same thing, all headed to Europe to join in the assault on the Germans. In Marrakech, we saw our first B-29s that were en route to India, China, or wherever. The trip to England required passing through the Bay of Biscay, which was well within range of German long-range fighters. This was the first time that we loaded ammunition in the tail and top turrets prior to takeoff. While the arrival in England was a bit anticlimactic, at least I was on land. It was cloudy. They drove on the wrong side of the road, and it was on the dreary side. After a few weeks bouncing around the country, we were shipped for a brief period into North Ireland for training in the how-to of the RAF's flight operations. On May 24th, I arrived with my crew at Great Dunmow Station 164, the 386 Bomb Group, and assigned to the 552nd Bomb Squadron. We were really welcomed, as the squadron had been short of crews, and mine was put to work, flying, that is, almost immediately. Personally, I had flown over from North Ireland with a cold and an ear infection in a C-47 and didn't get a mission in until June 4th. Waiting for the flight surgeon to clear me for flight was a concern, as having come this far, I wasn't able to go with my crew and fellow pilots. While waiting, the seriousness of combat became quite apparent as I watched the few missions take off and return. I learned the meaning of red flares being fired from an airplane about to land, wounded aboard. Flying missions was real combat, and my time was about to come, and I was off and running on June 4th. My early missions were scary, and you soon learn what flak was and what it could do to an airplane. After 2 missions as co-pilot, I flew my first one with my crew on D-Day, and a day that I shall never forget as the English Channel was full of surface ships from Portsmouth to Normandy beaches. Before continuing with this account, I need to explain a little bit about how the B-26s operated. Each of the 9th Air Force's 8 bomb groups usually put up 36 aircraft made up of 6 flights of 6 aircraft. Generally, each of the 6 flight leaders, with their bombardiers operating the northern bomb site, controlled the aiming and bomb release. The other 5 aircraft in each flight would release their bombs upon seeing the lead drop. The lead airplane in the flight was number 1, right wing 2, left wing 3, directly behind 1 was 4, thus 5 and 6. So in most missions there were 6 different flights taking aim at the assigned target. Each of the flights flew at slightly different altitudes to ensure separation to avoid collisions. New crews always flew in the 5 or 6 positions till they were considered experienced enough to handle 2 and 3. 5 and 6 was also called tail end Charlie. Next in line would be number 4, which is still easier, and this position was the backup to the leader if he ran into trouble, whatever may have happened. The rationale for this formation makeup was for good defense against enemy fighters while providing for effective bomb impact patterns. There were some maximum effort missions where the group would fly 54 aircraft, thus 9 flights. Being young and new in this role was some advantages. You may be scared, but so were nearly everyone else. The initial progress after the invasion was exciting, and the rate we were flying missions, it would appear that finishing my tour of 65 by Christmas was a good possibility. This thought was soon to fade, as on mission number 8, our plane took some serious hits, including my Bombardier. I knew almost immediately that the hydraulic system was knocked out, and my concern was to hang on until we returned to base to prepare for the landing. Although my Bombardier's engine injury was relatively minor, getting the landing gear and flaps down wasn't going to happen using the main system. Having been instructed to land last to consume for fuel, the question of crew bailout was briefly discussed, and there were no takers. The approach to landing was initiated after my engineer manually cranked down the flaps, knowing that this was irreversible. The emergency landing gear extension had also failed. The 4 of the crew seated in the floor of the navigator's compartment, facing aft. The touchdown was a big jolt and deceleration like I'd never experienced. Evacuation of the plane took only seconds as the top hatches were opened by the co-pilot while we were still sliding along the ground. The belly landing was a learning experience, and lucky that it occurred in an early mission. While I had sore knees joints for a few days from the push into the rudder pedals at impact, I recognized that every time you flew, you gained a little more knowledge as to what it could do when pressed in an emergency. The airplane never flew again and was salvaged for parts. And this is a typical thing that can happen with flak, and I'll elaborate that the flak can cause the airplane to be lost entirely. It can knock out an engine. Ordinarily, the hydraulic failure, you got an emergency system that will work. When the emergency system doesn't work, you're probably going to end up on the belly. Nose gear doesn't extend. It's not too bad. If you can put it on the runway, it just skips. And if you got one main gear that doesn't extend, it's pretty bad news, because you're inclined to break the airplane into two pieces, and probably if there's anybody in the back of the airplane, they're going to get hurt. Naturally, if you lose a wing or you got serious damage to the fuselage of the airplane, you want to fly, and so you're bailing out. And fire in the wing or fuselage or an engine is equally bad news. Anyhow, there were occasional 1 or 2 day passes to London, and by July my crew was given a week off called flak leave, a real break from action, and spent a week in a Red Cross operated facility near Salisbury, which is southwest of London, in an environment like a college fraternity, lots of sleep, good food, casual dress, no uniforms, and a total change from flying nearly every other day. Going to London was not much fun, as the buzz bombs were a distraction, as they had been coming over the base, and when you heard them coming, you had to sweat out their passing. They were okay as long as the engine continued to run, as London was generally their target. When it stopped early, you learned to dive for cover. My promotion to first lieutenant came through in July, which was good for my ego and felt like I had moved up in the world. Weather in Europe had been good through July and August, and I had been flying a mission every third day. Come September, the weather started to be a factor, and our troops were moving farther into France and a bit into Germany, which made for longer missions. Of the 8 operating B-26 groups, 4 had already moved to southern England and were shortly to move to the Normandy Beach area. On October the 2nd, the 386 made its move to France, just north of Paris near Beaumont-sur-Loire. As a former German fighter field and badly damaged by American and British bombing, including earlier visits by the 386th. At this point, my morale started to slump, as this was the beginning of a 6-month stay living in pyramidal tents with 4 other guys. The weather turned sour, and there was starting a period of mini missions, and a lot of them scrubbed. And scrub means it's canceled. I flew 3 missions in October, 1 in November, and now my tour completion date was starting to look like the following spring. We all were in the same boat, and it was time of bitch, bitch, bitch. At one point, I'd gone 6 weeks without receiving a letter from my family, due mostly to the change in location and mail logistics problems. We did have basic food, and you ate out of mess kits and learned to take baths out of tin help. Missions we flew were not getting easier, and the complications of weather just made it harder to deal with. The Allied advance had been slowed, and then came the Battle of the Bulge. December was to yield 4 missions and an unknown number of briefings. This period through early February was not a happy one at Airfield Bombardier 60, that is, as it was known officially, especially Christmas week. One of my buddies was killed in a nearby wooded area collecting firewood. Christmas Day was to see the airplane ahead of me crash on takeoff with a tent mate on board. The remaining airplanes aboarded and flew another mission in the afternoon. Frost on the wings was presumed to have been the problem. Later in the day, we learned that another group attacking the same planned target was hit by enemy fighters, knocking down 16 of 33 B-26s. It was a very dreary Christmas. We had Spam for dinner. I'll be okay here in a minute. My squadron was unfortunate in site selection in Beaumont and was relegated to space in the middle of the old airfield adjacent to runway 1028, which is east-west, where our airplanes were parked. This having been a former fighter base, the other 3 squadrons were assigned those original dispersal areas. No one in the group enjoyed anything better than a tent to live in, but getting around the base was very difficult and a radical change from the arrangements available back in Great Dunmow. Showers were set up a couple times a week and were available as long as you were willing to make about a half-mile hike across the squadron area. We had rain, mud, more rain, more mud, snow, cold, more snow, cold, and more mud. Staying dry was a challenge, as it was staying warm, especially flying. Skinny taxiways were more than a challenge. It cost a few propellers when a pilot got too close to the edge and slipped off as he tried to negotiate a turn. The operational runway was 624, which operated but 3 choices. 2 to land and a third was to go to another base. By Christmas I had 2 passes to Paris, and this was a most welcome change of scenery. There was something of that saying about how do you keep them down on the farm after they've seen Paris. It made up for a lot, but living in tents was a very unpleasant experience that I still hate to think about. At the end of December, I earned another flag leave, and this time it was a trip to Southport, England, not far from Blackpool, in an old resort hotel run by the Red Cross. The best part about this was simply getting away from Tent City and Beaumont. The bad part was you knew you had to come back. At the time of our move to France, I was designated flight leader and moved up to the number 4 position. This was good for my morale and included a few additional responsibilities, and soon was leading flights, although at a lower frequency. Finally got my co-pilot Don Wright checked out as first pilot and saw him fly as pilot in command. About this time in December and early January, all my original crew had completed their 65 missions and were on their way back to the States. The 552nd had a small officers club that served as a gathering spot, especially if you wanted to stay warm. Each tent had a pot-belly stove, but you had to scrounge for and gather your own firewood. By January, all the bombed-out buildings and downed trees within walking distance had been cleared of wood by the members of the squadron just to keep those stoves supplied. The mess tent had a supply of coal briquettes that had to be protected by armed guards to prevent midnight requisitions. Eventually, the squadron was provided with a mess hall built by the French contract laborers that made for us significant improvement in eating arrangements, and although mess kits remained as standard. I have to comment the armed guards, and looking at one of my letters home at that point in time, I was one of those guys guilty of filching coal. It was about shortly after that they put guards on the coal pile, which just made you scramble that much harder and hope for better weather. At Great Dunmow, we had a laundry service available built in France, but in France we learned that several homes in the adjacent village of Brulère would do our clothes for a small price as long as we supplied soap. Later, as the weather warmed and I was anticipating going home and wanted to reduce my inventory of clothes, I sent a bunch home dirty. I remember very well how a number of French men and boys would be waiting outside the mess tent where we cleaned our mess kits as in a series of tubs to take scraps of leftover food. It was quite apparent that the local people were not eating well when we first arrived. The area around the airfield had not been liberated until near the end of August of '44. In December, we were hearing that the group most likely would be converting to the different airplane the Douglas A-26 Invader. Some of these had arrived while we were in Great Denville when assigned to the 553rd Bomb Squadron. After flying a few evaluation missions, they were taken away, and later one of the A-20 groups made the conversion. I was approached as to my interest in continuing to fly the Martin or slow down and wait for the new airplane. It wasn't an easy decision. I did vacillate for some time but finally concluded that flying nearly all the B-26 missions for the next couple of months wasn't what I wanted to do. The war in Europe was going to be settled surely by spring, if not by summer. Then what happens? It looked like one would end up going to the South Pacific after a short period back in the States. I finally gambled and told my CO I would go with the new airplane and started showing up early in February. It was an easy airplane to fly. I checked out in about 2 flights, had one session with my Bombardier, and flew my first mission on the 22nd of February. By March, the weather was improving. The mission frequency was almost back to the tempo of the previous summer. The A-26 was operated with essentially the same procedures as the Marauder, except it would fly very well on one engine. This was a single pilot airplane with one gunner plus a bombardier and navigator when flying lead. This was a major change in flight crews as many finished their required missions and went home, and many others were assigned to other B-26 groups. This was another low point in for me, and so many of my buddies were gone. The good thing was I could see the light at the end of the tunnel, that is, completion of my tour. Unfortunately, I found myself counting to the end, and then I started to wonder if I could make it. I had been very lucky, and the Germans could hit an A-26 just as well, just as easily as a B-26. In late March, I was given my promotion to captain, which was a nice boost for my morale. Because I had a number of qualifying lead missions for which I was given 1 1/4 credits, I flew my 62nd and last mission on April 8th of '45. The next day, the group moved to Citation, A-92, Belgium. This had been a major airfield prior to the war, and the Germans had made good use of it after it was liberated, and the Allies used the field as an emergency base for airplanes like the B-24s and the 8th Air Force B-17s, shot up with wounded aboard trying to get back to England. Citation is between Liège and Brussels, and again placed the group much closer to the enemy lines as missions out of A-60 were becoming really a stretch for our fuel capacity. Accommodations were first class with brick quarters, an officers club, and were required to dress for dinner, which was a new thing. What a change. Although I never visited the enlisted men's quarters, they occupied a multiple-story facility on the other side of the airfield. No more tents. My stay in Slanker wasn't to last long, as the war had been slowing down and missions flowing, and the Allied ground forces were moving rapidly across Germany. The war in Europe was about to end. The duties at this time were mostly to help with squadron operations and checking out a few former co-pilots, first in Martin B-26 and the A-26. There were routine test tops, weekly trips to the group's flak house or rest home located south of Paris. We ran a shuttle with the Squadron 1 remaining B-26 loaded 12 to 15 men and flying down to Bourget Y-50, which was just about a 1-hour trip. Generally, these were ground crew, and I don't remember anyone being equipped with a parachute except me and my flight engineer. It took at least a pilot and engineer to operate the B-26. This was a unique way to travel for a weekly. We would be met by a truck at the airfield with the previous week's contingent to be returned to St. John. I never did get to visit the facility, but everyone who had such a leave there thoroughly enjoyed their stay. The war was coming to a halt, and another veteran, Pete Bingham, and I became concerned that perhaps we should move ahead and start the long trip home. There were indications that we could be a mass movement of men back to the States, and being delayed might not be to our liking. This we did on May 6, 1945, flying my last time in a B-26 to Orly Field in Paris, and then on a C-47 to London. Neither of us thought we should stay there over VE Day celebrations, and took the train up to Stoke-on-Trent, where I had been on the year before when I arrived in England. From there it was to a ship at Swansea and a 17-day junket back to Camp Kilmer, and then home for 30 days with my family and friends. I was confronted with a serious decision upon getting off the boat that I was eligible for separation from the service with all the points I'd accrued, decorations, time overseas, etc. I was getting acquainted with what the GI Bill offered, and after going to Santa Ana, California, was advised that my service could only be used as an instructor in advanced flying schools in B-25s. The airlines were taking pilots, but I made the decision to get out and go back to Purdue by Labor Day. My first week I was home in early August. I felt a little uncomfortable, but when the bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I realized again how lucky I had been. It's your turn.
It's my turn. Okay.
I did get through it.
You did great. You did great.
But there's just a lot of little details, and some guys could go on hour after hour.
I think one detail people would be interested in would be what a typical mission was like. There's supposed to be no such thing as a typical mission, but how did you find out where you were going to go? How did you prepare for a mission? And what was it like going on a mission?
Scary. When I become a flight leader, I had an assignment at group operations to help plan. Generally, it was a 24-hour duty, and you would go on duty in the early morning. The mission was already scheduled, but in the evening hours, there would be a message come in from, I guess it was wing headquarters or bomb division. Anyhow, what the target would be for the day, how many aircraft, what the bomb loading would be, the route to the target, whenever the rendezvous would be with fighters, call signs and all that kind of information. And you would do an initial rough order of magnitude planning of how the mission would go the next day, timing, and then you would back up when the takeoff would be, when the taxi time, when start engine time, briefing time, chow time, get-up time. And the target could be well, we'd gotten a lot of the bridges early in the days before the invasion, but there were still a couple bridges that across the Moselle River and the Rhine River were pretty juicy targets. And they would send several groups of B-26s out to attack the bridge because you're never sure that one airplane could do it, or one flight, or one group. They tended to try overkill and make sure they got them. Because they were all primary targets. There were bridges, railroad yards. In that book I showed you the one bullseye target. I mean, you were evaluated about how well you did. And the takeoff interval was set up so that 36 airplanes would be airborne in 12 minutes. And you were making takeoff intervals in 20-second intervals. And you used right and left inside of the runway. And the flight leader would fly out 2 minutes, do a 180. The next guy behind him would be turning inside of him, and the other 4 airplanes would turn inside it, so that when the lead come back by the field, he had 6 airplanes. And it's just repeated, and you go around the racetrack until you got 36 airplanes climbing on course, which I think that is one of the fascinating things about the war in flying combat, was that period of time when you did that form up and bring all those 36 airplanes together with one common goal. I mean, you weren't stacked on top of each other, but you were a little bit in trail so that you could bomb with them. And then when you made the trip home, you had a landing routine, except we landed in 30-second intervals. So you'd get, you'd have everybody on the ground in about 18 minutes.
What kind of opposition?
Opposition was flak. Flak. That's what got my 8th mission. Flak was identified oftentimes in the advanced information, or it was sorted out before the group briefing. There are a lot of known flak positions, heavily defended areas. They'd always have the maps marked with a red arc around them. That if you have to go inside that, you're going to have to do something about evasive action. And that's one of the things I meant to talk about, was the evasive action which we used. For the German flak gunners on 88, 105, to track a flight of airplanes, cut their fuse, fire the projectile, and get it up to altitude was roughly 20 seconds. And if a burst of flak showed up near you in flight, you better be starting your turn of a few degrees, and not sharply, just enough to move off course. So the next volley of flak, and they operated generally with 4 guns, and go pow, 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 pow. And that black stuff, when it, if it was close, it would be rattling off the airplane, or heaven help you, hit you. And there was always a game with the flak gunners. I've been on missions where I was flying in a high flight. The lead flight was at 12.5. The high flight was 12.8. The low flight would be 12.2. And then the next box, 18 behind, was displaced another 1,000 feet. where I was flying up, I won't forget the name because it was Lindbergh, Germany. And they were shooting at me. I was in high flight, and I kept maneuvering, and I walked all the way across the formation. I was up above them by a couple hundred feet, and they were picking on me, and I never will forget that. They didn't get me, and I don't know. I don't remember what it did to the rest of the guys in the mission, but I was trying to duck them, and the flak was coming from my right. I knew that from the Bombardier and navigator up front. They could tell that. And you always had to stay away from any known flak position. And if it was a new one, you had to really be paying attention and doing what we used as evasive action. But you wouldn't come up on the bomb run, which is about 4 minutes away from the target. The Bombardier navigator is calling the shots. Navigator takes it up to a point where the Bombardier can see the target in his sight and be prepared to make a few adjustments so that you don't throw the bombs away. And you're vulnerable there for probably a minute or two because you've had to settle down and do the job, which is dropping the bombs on a target. As far as fighters were a problem early on when you run across the channel, and the Germans had bases in the Calais area, and they would hop up and pick off anybody that they could find. But as the invasion advanced on through, the fighters were less of a concern. I can only remember one mission where we had fighters. But I'd say flak was an issue at least half of the time. I mean, you saw it either in or around the mission, and there would be a third of the missions, if you could check my logbook, which I have a little F circled, and there were a lot of those F plus and double plus.
Let's talk about the 8th mission.
The 8th mission?
Yeah.
Oh, this was early in the game. I was back in the formation, and we were flying a little lower because it was post D-Day, and you knew that you're hit because the flak rattled around the airplane.
You could hear it.
Oh, when you hear it, you're too close. And the Bombardier, I think he had let out a response because he got hit in the elbow, and the smoke had come up through the cockpit, and I think it was a result of the hot projectile hitting a hydraulic line and vaporizing the hydraulic fluid. And the hydraulic pressure went to 0, so I knew I had a problem. You couldn't control the cylinder head temperature. We had cowl flaps, and you couldn't adjust those, so you just stand pat, and you realize that you got a problem. You didn't know how bad it was, that you couldn't get the gear down. The gear, nose gear, doors open. The uplock on the nose gear released, but I couldn't, got nothing else. And later model airplanes had a mechanical device that you could pull the main gear uplocks and they would fall down by gravity, but this was an older airplane. didn't have that equipment.
So you had no landing gear,
No landing,
and you're coming back.
coming back. And I
Did
got
that
back.
happen before you dropped your load, or?
Oh, I dropped a load. I don't know whether, I don't even remember whether the airplane was hit before the bombs were released. That's a detail it's not in my memory bank. But we were probably flying 4,000 or 5,000 feet because we were in there under a layer of clouds.
Okay.
And there was a period of time where we dropped very low, and dropping bombs was, if you had big enough bombs, you wouldn't be too low because the bomb explosion would rattle the airplane, and you could feel them go off. Of course, when you dropped, we carried two 2,000 pounders, four 1,000, two 500s, and all of them. It was, I think we could carry 20 250s in some cases. The 250 was a spatial bomb, which you sort of double rack it, keep them together. And after every mission, when you landed, you were thoroughly debriefed. The intelligence guys would team up and catch you as you returned to the squadron area, or in England to the. We had a group set up there.
In this case, you're flying back home across the channel without any hydraulic fluid.
Right.
And what was going through your mind?
Hoped it all worked. And when I guess I was a little surprised that the emergency system didn't work, but it became obvious, and we had a reservoir of additional hydraulic fluid, and we poured that into the system, which you could do, but it was just going overboard through the leak. And it was a test because if you can get this thing down, you can mark one up. And I guess I was lucky that this happened to me early in the game, because it conditions your mind as to, you survived that one, maybe the next one could be tougher.
And you landed it, you said, on the grass next to the runway.
Well, they wanted us to stay clear of the runway because it was a belly landing and you couldn't pick the airplane up and get it off of the runway. And it was in the grass, gravel area. And that's the reason in that footage you see that one puff of smoke. It would land in dirt, gravel, grass. I don't know what it was. But that today is the first time I could visibly detect that. I hit the ground and it sort of bounced a little bit. And the bounce would come because, well, you're flying approach at 150 miles an hour, and you don't have as much drag with the gear down, so you ballooned in ground effect a little bit.
Right. So you came in at 150 miles an hour.
That's what was standard operating procedure. And if you had we used to make a lot of missions where you get out, you can't bomb, you come back and land with the bombs. And
you said that your crew discussed bailing out, and in the end,
I gave them a choice. I said, "Do you want to bail out?"
how did it feel to know that they would all rather stay with you in the plane than jump out?
I thought one of them would be gutsy enough to try to parachute. I thought the tail gunner might bail out.
Sounds like they had more confidence in you.
Well, they'd flown with me probably at that point several hundred hours. I guess 200 or 300 hours. They had a name for me.
What they call you?
Hot Rock.
Hot Rock. How did you get that nickname?
The tail gunner did some artwork. We were trying to figure out what kind of emblem we would put on the airplane. And I think in my possession somewhere I may have that little sketch he did. Anyhow.
If we have time, I'd like to ask a couple questions about training. The B-26 is a famous airplane for being killer to learn to fly. Would you like to talk about that?
I told you about my first ride.
I'm thinking of the famous motto, one a day in Tampa Bay.
That was a little bit overplayed. That's an expression that got bandied around with the press, I think. It wasn't truly one a day in Tampa Bay, according to the information I've gathered through the years. They did dump a lot of them in the bay. It was, the airplane had a characteristic of being sensitive to having a lot of airspeed when you're climbing out. If you haven't got the airplane cleaned up and you lost an engine, it's going to corkscrew on you. And one of the problems was skill in flying the airplane on one engine. We used to practice, and so help me God, I'd go to 5,000 feet and go up and feather an engine, bring it back in, maybe feather another, and just do this a lot of time. You get comfortable at it. And the airplane had electric propellers on it, control the pitch position, and they had problems with the generators and the electric controls. And if the generators weren't charging the batteries, you'd lost a generator. On takeoff, the prop would not change pitch, and the prop overspeeds. And when it overspeeds, it's sort of acting like a barn door out there. And the only way you can solve that is you either pull back the power, and then you're going to go in this way, or if you let it wind up more, you tear the engine apart. And it's a scary sound to hear that. And if you had both of them doing that, it's really bad.
We only have a few minutes left. I'd like to ask you about your dad and growing up in a very special place in aviation history.
My dad used to talk about watching the Wright brothers fly off of Huffman Prairie. And when I heard him talk about that, it was well along in his years. And this was in 1905, because my grandfather lived less than 2 miles from Huffman Prairie. And it's up on a little mesa as you come down what is Highway 4 today. It's up there, and they sold the farm, and I went back and did some research. It was sold in 1906. So that was the time that the Wright brothers built an airplane, and they didn't take it to
Kitty Hawk.
to Kitty Hawk.
They stayed in Dayton.
It stayed in Dayton. They flew it down there. And that, my dad talked about, they had a device and I've since learned what it is. It's sort of a slingshot arrangement. Anyhow, I don't think he got down there and talked to him. He rode his bicycle, which would have been probably a mile, mile and a half. It was the closest he could get on the highway. And in 1905, the roads wouldn't have amounted to much. But I've done a little research on that, and I haven't pieced it together to make a story on it, but it's a doable thing.
Is there anything you'd like to add to conclude the interview today?
Make sure you put a header on this, the airplane that won the war in Europe, the B-26.
Got it. Mrs. Slater, thank you very much.
And the targets were moving deeper and deeper into Germany, and the missions were becoming longer, and there was the prospect of her moving to another base closer to the target, to the bomb line. But I finished my last mission, got my quota in by the 8th of April of 45, and on the 9th of April our bomb group moved to Belgium in St. Tron. In the middle of all this, in February of 45, our group was given new equipment, and we started flying the Douglas A-26, which built, it was a derivative of the Douglas A-20, and the airplane was operated with a much smaller crew because of the equipment we had on board. Anyhow, I had flown 52 missions in the Martin V-26 and 10 missions in the Douglas airplane, and they said with the number of flight leads that you've had, you've made your quota, and I was eligible to return to the United States. In that last few weeks up in Belgium was a case of being quite relaxed and knowing that I wasn't going to have to get shot at anymore. And I must admit that as the calendar turned and the missions piled up, you started to sweat out the number that you had left to fly, and that became quite worrisome. And after you had flown 50 or 60 missions, were they going to get you on the last mission or not? And you started to worry about surviving, because the Germans were sending up a lot of flak through all this time, and fighters were a threat, and it was at a point in time when you got quite concerned about this whole thing. B-26 crash landing. The name of the airplane was really the Spirit of Pansy Joachim, but on the right hand side was the artwork Carefree Carolyn. This is 5 of the crew. One guy was hurt getting out of the airplane, and I'm on the left there. Co-pilot next to me, Bombardier, and the tail gunner sitting down on the ground, and on top of the airplane was the flight engineer. Radio operator got hurt. 1944, probably July time period, at our base in England, Great Dunmow. These are 7 of the guys that lived in the hut number 12. These were Nissen huts that were part of the British prepared facilities for the Air Force. anyhow, all these guys I flew with and lived the war until we moved on to France. Got a site in France near Paris called A60, and it shows the general type of accommodations we lived in, with tents in the boardwalk, and it was Tent City. It was not fun. This is a Douglas A-26 Invader, which become part of our the equipment we flew. And the name of this was Gambler's Luck, which I flew many times. I was a flight leader, and this version carried a Bombardier navigator, the gunner in the back of the airplane, and a single pilot. A-26 with the flak in the lower part of the film or photograph. And that's the real war of fighting the Germans. They kept shooting at us all the time. The human side of the war was. These are 9 guys out of the 552nd Bomb Squadron, Operation Tent. I was in the 386 bomb group, one of 8 bomb groups in European Theater of Operation. Anyhow, these are all the guys that I was flying with. At A60 in Beaumont-sur-Oise, France. Picture of myself in front of my living quarters, being a pyramidal U.S. Army tent. The event was the day I got my promotion to captain.